In the heart of the rugged wilderness, a lone prospector faced the fiercest blizzard of his life, armed with nothing but a simple ember trick. This one small act would become a lifeline, a survival method that would be passed down through generations. But how did a single ember save his life when the storm swallowed everything else? Before we dive deeper, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love tales of survival and ingenuity from the American frontier, hit that subscribe button. Trust us, tomorrow's episode will be even more unbelievable than today's. The winter winds howled across the barren landscape, transforming the mountains into a ghostly, wind-swept white wilderness. For Ethan Reed, the storm was a thing to be reckoned with, but not one he hadn't faced before. He had spent years in the cold, a seasoned prospector and mountain man, his calloused hands and hardened soul shaped by the relentless forces of nature. He had survived blizzards, bear encounters, and near starvation. But this storm was different. Ethan sat beside the warmth of his stone fire pit, his face shadowed by the long, wild beard that had grown in the harsh mountain air. His leather jacket, frayed at the edges, and thick woolen trousers were the only things standing between him and the biting cold. Outside, the snow fell in thick sheets, each flake driven by the fierce wind, as though nature itself was trying to bury him alive. The small cabin behind him creaked in protest, the sound barely audible over the roaring winds. His cabin was built solidly, with logs that had been painstakingly selected and fit together, a crude but effective shelter against the wilds of the Rockies. Yet, even the best cabins could only protect so much. As the storm raged on, Ethan knew that if he didn't act soon, he would be trapped or worse. He had prepared for this moment, as he had done countless times before. A prospector never left anything to chance. But something gnawed at him this time. This storm was unlike any other. He could feel it deep in his bones. It wasn't just the wind, it was the weight of the snow, the violent intensity of the storm that shook him to his core. If this storm lasted longer than expected, survival would come down to one thing: the fire. The fire that crackled softly before him was not just for warmth, it was the beacon of his survival. It was the ember trick, his secret weapon. Ethan had learned it years ago from a fellow prospector, a grizzled old man who swore by it a way to keep a fire burning even when the fiercest storms threatened to snuff it out. It was a method that had saved many lives on the frontier, but it was a secret passed between men who understood the unforgiving nature of the wild. As the wind howled louder, Ethan adjusted the pile of rocks surrounding the fire, carefully placing another log on the embers. The key was to keep the fire small and contained, just enough to maintain heat without drawing too much attention. Too large a blaze, and it could attract unwanted visitors, creatures of both the four-legged and two-legged variety. But too small, and the storm would have the advantage. Tonight, the fire was his only ally. It would be his shield against the freezing cold, his protector against the storm. And as the wind raged against his cabin, Ethan Reed knew the ember trick would be his key to survival. Ethan didn't sleep that night. His eyes remained fixed on the fire, watching the way the embers shifted in the stone pit. The howling winds outside were a constant reminder of how fragile life could be out here in the wilderness. A man's strength was only as good as his will to survive, and tonight Ethan's will was being tested. The storm was intensifying. He could feel it in the air, that oppressive heaviness that came before a full-blown blizzard. A man who knew the mountains well could sense the change, the way the storm moved, the way the air felt colder and heavier. By now, the snow was thick enough that he could barely see beyond the cabin's edge, and he knew that any movement outside would risk being swallowed whole by the storm. It was just past midnight when the first sign of trouble appeared. The silence was broken by a crack, not the creak of the cabin settling, but something more ominous, something unnatural. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He moved quickly, grabbing his rifle from the corner and creeping to the window. Through the thick falling snow, he saw a shape, dark and massive, moving against the white expanse. A bear. A grizzly, by the size of it. The beast moved slowly, cautiously, its large paws sinking into the deep snow. It must have been drawn by the scent of the fire, or perhaps it was simply on the prowl. Ethan's heart raced, his fingers tightening around the rifle. He knew the bear would test the cabin, just as they all did, clawing, biting, searching for a way in. But the danger wasn't just the bear. It was the cold. The storm could freeze a man faster than any predator could. And if the bear didn't get to him, the storm might. He stood there, watching through the window, calculating his next move. The bear circled the cabin, sniffing at the air, testing the perimeter. Ethan didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He knew that if the bear sensed him, he would have no chance. He waited. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. The bear paused just outside the door, its massive form illuminated by the flickering light of the fire. Ethan's breath caught in his chest as the bear's head turned in his direction, sniffing the air again. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the bear moved on, disappearing into the snow. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He knew that the bear would return and the storm would only grow worse, but for now he had survived the first test. It wasn't the last he would face, but the Ember trick had already proven its worth. The fire was his lifeline, and tonight it would keep him alive. The storm raged on, a relentless fury that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The fire in Ethan's cabin had dimmed to a faint glow, its warmth barely enough to keep the bitter cold at bay. The wind howled like a wild animal outside, battering against the cabin's walls, making the logs groan in protest. Ethan had managed to keep the fire burning through the night, but he knew it wouldn't last much longer without more wood. He rose from his spot by the fire, his joints aching from the cold, and stepped toward the door. His breath fogged the air as he reached for his coat. He needed more wood for the fire, not just for warmth, but for survival. The next few days were going to be brutal, and if he couldn't keep the fire going, his chances of surviving the storm were slim. As Ethan opened the door, the full force of the storm hit him. The snow, thick and swirling, covered the ground like a white blanket. Visibility was nearly non-existent, and the air was so frigid that it bit at his skin. He could barely make out the edge of the forest, the trees swaying violently in the wind. But despite the storm's wrath, Ethan knew he had no choice but to gather more wood. His eyes scanned the area, searching for the familiar stumps and fallen logs that would serve as his firewood. He took a deep breath and stepped outside, the crunch of snow underfoot the only sound in the otherwise deafening silence. The storm seemed to swallow every sound, amplifying the isolation of the wilderness. As he ventured further from the cabin, Ethan's mind wandered. He had been in these mountains long enough to know that no matter how prepared a man thought he was, nature always had the final say. The storm was a reminder of that. His hands tightened around the axe handle, the cold making his fingers stiff as he chopped at a fallen log. The rhythmic thwack of the axe against wood was a small comfort in the chaos outside. It wasn't until he had gathered a few logs that he noticed the tracks in the snow. At first, they seemed like animal tracks, but as he looked closer, he realized they were too large, too deliberate. These were human tracks. A chill ran down his spine as he followed the trail through the snow. Whoever it was, they were moving toward his cabin. In this weather, it was unusual for anyone to be out here, let alone someone approaching his isolated cabin. Ethan's heart rate quickened as he gripped his rifle, his breath coming in sharp bursts in the frigid air. As the tracks led him closer to the cabin, he saw a figure emerge from the snowstorm. It was a man, stumbling through the snow, his clothes torn and worn. His face was pale, his lips cracked and blue from the cold. Ethan hesitated, unsure of what to do. The man was clearly in distress, but in these parts, a stranger could be as much of a threat as a blessing. The wilderness had no room for the weak, and Ethan had learned long ago that trust was a luxury no one could afford. "Who are you?" Ethan called out, his voice carrying over the wind. The stranger's eyes widened as he looked up, his mouth moving, but the wind drowned out his words. Ethan motioned for him to come closer. The man staggered forward, barely able to stand. Ethan caught him just as he collapsed, and the realization hit him hard. This man was not going to survive much longer if he didn't act quickly. "Get inside," Ethan muttered, his voice grim. He helped the stranger to his feet and led him into the cabin, closing the door behind them. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. As Ethan set the man down by the fire, He knew the storm was about to throw yet another obstacle in his path. And this time, it wasn't just the weather he had to face, it was the unknown. The stranger was unconscious when Ethan laid him by the fire, his breathing shallow and labored. Ethan worked quickly, grabbing the man's frayed coat and pulling it off, revealing frostbitten skin beneath. The man was cold, too cold. Ethan knew that without immediate attention, the stranger wouldn't last through the night. The storm outside was savage, and the cold was merciless. Ethan grabbed the nearest blanket and wrapped it tightly around the man, his mind racing with the gravity of the situation. There was no way to tell how long the man had been out in the storm, but judging by the condition of his clothing, it had been too long. The storm outside would have been more than enough to kill an unprepared soul. Ethan had seen it happen before. Men who thought they could brave the elements without proper gear, without knowledge, never returned. He turned to the fire. The Ember trick had kept him alive up until this point, but now it was more important than ever. He could feel the heat of the fire, but it wasn't enough to warm the entire cabin. The small flame had to be maintained, carefully tended to. A few logs more would keep it alive for another hour, maybe two. But with both of them needing warmth, it wouldn't last long. Ethan moved to the stove in the corner of the cabin and grabbed his rifle. He had to be ready for anything. The storm had a way of twisting a man's mind. A man could die from exposure long before his body succumbed to the cold. His hands shook slightly as he loaded the rifle, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The stranger stirred slightly, groaning in his sleep. Ethan turned his attention back to the fire, adjusting the logs to keep the embers alive. He had learned this trick from the old prospector back in the day, a way to keep the fire small and controlled, but with enough heat to last through the worst of the storm. It was a survival method passed down over years, a trick that only those who knew the land could use. Ethan wasn't sure if the stranger would survive the night, but he knew he wouldn't die in the storm, not if he could help it. As he sat by the fire, Ethan kept a steady eye on the window, the storm still howling outside. The wind had died down slightly, but it was still a fierce, unrelenting force. He couldn't help but wonder who this man was and how he had ended up so far from civilization. No one ventured into these mountains unless they had to. The frontier was unforgiving, and it didn't welcome visitors. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft cough from the stranger. Ethan's gaze snapped back to the man by the fire. He was awake, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. Where am I?" the man rasped, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You're safe for now," Ethan replied, his voice low. "But you won't be if you don't stay warm. Rest up." The stranger nodded weakly, and Ethan turned back to the fire, adjusting the embers. The storm outside had not stopped, but for now they had a chance. And with the Ember trick, maybe, just maybe, they could both make it through the night. The storm raged outside, a constant reminder of the fury the wilderness could unleash. Inside, the cabin had become a fragile sanctuary, the warmth of the fire the only thing standing between Ethan and the deadly cold. The stranger, now conscious but weak, lay wrapped in blankets by the hearth, his breathing more regular but still labored. Ethan hadn't expected to find anyone out here, let alone someone on the verge of death. Yet here he was, a man stranded in the snowstorm with nothing but the barest of tools for survival. Ethan moved quietly around the cabin, gathering what little he had left. The storm had kept him inside for the last few days, and he was running low on supplies. His dried meats were nearly gone, and the last of his tobacco had been spent. Still, he had enough to get by, at least for a little while. What worried him more was the fire. The Ember trick, a small miracle in itself, required constant attention. Even the smallest lapse in focus could lead to disaster. He sat by the fire, adjusting the logs carefully, making sure the embers stayed alive. The fire wasn't just a source of warmth, it was a lifeline. If it went out, the cold would take over, and with both men stuck in this cabin, they'd have no chance. The longer the storm lasted, the harder it would be to keep the fire going. Ethan knew he had to be careful. The stranger stirred again, his eyes flickering open. His gaze was unfocused at first, but slowly it sharpened, locking on Ethan. "Thanks for saving me," the stranger rasped, his voice hoarse and weak. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "No one survives out there without help," he muttered, not meeting the man's eyes. The stranger shifted, wincing from pain. "I didn't expect to make it. Thought I'd freeze out there. I was lost. No food. No shelter." Ethan's eyes narrowed as he continued to stoke the fire. "You weren't the first to think that way." There was a long silence between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Ethan hadn't planned on taking anyone in, especially not someone he didn't know. The wilderness wasn't a forgiving place, and trust was a dangerous thing. But the storm had left him no choice. He couldn't just leave the man to die in the snow, and now he'd become responsible for him. The reality of that burden was heavy, but Ethan wasn't new to responsibility. "So, what's your name?" Ethan asked, glancing over at the stranger. "James," the man whispered, his eyes fluttering closed again, as if the effort of speaking had drained him. Ethan nodded again. "You rest. I'll keep the fire going." James muttered something unintelligible, too weak to respond, and his breathing deepened once more. Ethan shifted his attention back to the fire, adjusting the embers with slow, deliberate movements. The flame was steady now, but he knew it wouldn't last forever. The storm outside showed no sign of stopping, and with each passing hour, the cold was closing in. Ethan's eyes swept over the cabin. He had everything in place: a secure cabin, firewood stocked, a rifle at the ready, and enough supplies to last a few days. But it wasn't enough, not in a storm like this. The cold would seep in, finding any crack, any weakness. It always did. It had claimed so many before him, and it wasn't done yet. The real test was coming. As the days passed, the storm showed no signs of abating. The wind howled with a fury that shook the very walls of the cabin, and the snow continued to fall, burying the world outside in a blanket of white. The cabin had become a small island in the middle of an unforgiving ocean of ice. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional groan of the cabin as it fought against the storm. Ethan's days had fallen into a quiet rhythm. He checked on James, making sure the man was staying warm, keeping the fire alive, and gathering what little food he had left. It wasn't much: a few dried pieces of meat, some salt, and a bit of coffee. Not enough for 2 men over an extended period, but it was all he had. They would have to make it last. James had grown stronger, though still weak. His fever had broken, but he wasn't out of the woods yet. He had been through too much, too quickly. The wilderness had a way of sapping a man's strength until there was nothing left. Even though the fire kept the cabin warm, it couldn't replace the energy a body needed to heal. "You need to eat," Ethan said one evening as he handed James a small portion of dried meat. James had been too weak to get out of bed, and Ethan had been doing his best to take care of him. But the burden of survival was heavier than he anticipated. The storm, the constant vigilance with the fire, the limited resources, it was all wearing on him. "I'm not hungry," James muttered, weakly, his voice still rough from days of dehydration. "You'll need your strength if you want to make it out of here," Ethan replied, his voice blunt. "We don't know how long this storm's going to last. Could be days, could be longer." James glanced at the small portion of meat in Ethan's hand but didn't reach for it. "I can't just sit here while you do everything." Ethan gave him a hard look. "You can and you will. For now, I'm the one keeping us alive. You rest. That's an order." James met his gaze, eyes tired but defiant. "I'm not the type of man to just sit around." Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh. "Neither am I, but sometimes it's all you can do. Rest, conserve your strength. You'll need it for whatever comes next." James didn't respond, and Ethan turned back to the fire, his face hardening into a mask of determination. He couldn't afford distractions. They both had to survive, no matter what it took. But he knew one thing for certain: the storm was still out there, and it wouldn't let them off easy. That night, as the wind howled louder and the snow piled higher against the walls of the cabin, Ethan stared into the fire, his thoughts turning dark. The wilderness had a way of making you question everything. And tonight, the storm seemed to whisper a single truth: this battle was far from over. The wind howled outside, a relentless icy roar that rattled the cabin's timbers. Inside, the air was thick with the weight of silence. Ethan stared into the fire, the flames flickering as he carefully adjusted the embers. The warmth it provided seemed to be the only thing that stood between him and the suffocating cold beyond the walls. But even the fire was fading, the logs crackling less and less as the hours dragged on. There wasn't much left to burn, and Ethan knew he needed to ration the last of his firewood, or they'd be in trouble. James was still resting on the blankets by the fire, his eyes closed, though he wasn't sleeping. He hadn't spoken much in the past day, only shifting occasionally in his sleep, still too weak to do anything but focus on recovering. Ethan's eyes occasionally drifted over to the man, wondering what had driven him so far into the wilderness. The storm had been a cruel stroke of fate for both of them, but it had forced Ethan to take responsibility for a stranger. A man who, despite the hardships, still had a fire in his heart that didn't match his current state. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It wasn't the time for questions. There was no time for uncertainty. Survival had become the only thing that mattered. He had made the decision to save James, and now he had to stick to it, no matter how grim things got. That was the rule out here. You made your choice, and you saw it through, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The storm was still fierce. He had to think about the long term. The firewood was going fast, and the food supply wasn't much better. If the storm kept up much longer, they'd have nothing left. Ethan had been here long enough to know that the weather didn't care about their hopes or needs. It would break them if they weren't careful. He stood, his muscles sore from the constant vigilance. The fire had to be kept alive. Turning to the window, Ethan saw the snow swirling outside in thick gusts. The world was a blur of white, no longer recognizable as the mountain land he had come to know. All that was left was this tiny cabin, the two of them, and the promise of survival. A promise that, right now, felt as fragile as the last spark of the fire. The storm had become something more than just weather. It was a force of nature, a test, and it was dragging them deeper into its grip. Ethan had never seen a blizzard like this one that seemed to have no end. Day after day, the snow continued to fall, thick and suffocating. The winds never ceased, tearing at the small cabin like a wild animal. James, though still weak, had started to improve. His fever had broken, and he was stronger now, able to sit up and eat small amounts of food. But even with his recovery, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They couldn't stay here forever. The storm might have driven them into this cabin, but it wouldn't let them leave so easily. The fire crackled faintly, its warmth barely enough to stave off the encroaching cold. The night was long, the darkness stretching out endlessly in the storm's grip. Ethan had been watching the fire when he heard James speak. "I don't think we're going to make it," James muttered, his voice rough from both the storm and the fever that still clung to his body. Ethan didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. The truth was, part of him agreed. The longer the storm lasted, the slimmer their chances of making it out alive. Yet, to say it out loud would be to admit defeat, something neither of them could afford to do. "We make our own fate," Ethan said at last, his voice low but steady. "You don't get to give up, not now." James didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said more than words ever could. Ethan could see the doubt in him, just as he felt it in himself. He had been alone in these mountains for years, surviving on his wits and strength. But now, with another man depending on him, it was different. He had never thought he'd have to share his survival, his life, with someone else. James fell silent again, and Ethan, lost in his own thoughts, watched the fire. The storm raged outside, and Ethan realized they were running out of time. The fire wouldn't last forever, and neither would the food. He knew they would have to venture out soon, despite the storm, if they were to have any chance of survival. But that was a decision for tomorrow. Tonight, the storm had them in its grip, and all they could do was hold on for just one more night. The storm seemed to be closing in around them, suffocating the land with a relentless cold. The walls of the cabin shuddered under the weight of the wind, and the fire had dwindled to a mere flicker of light, struggling to hold on in the face of the bitter cold that now seemed to seep through every crack in the logs. The temperature had dropped, and it felt as though the storm would never end. James had been growing weaker again, despite his earlier recovery. The fever had returned, and he was shivering uncontrollably, even with the blankets wrapped around him. Ethan kept a close eye on him, but there wasn't much he could do. His own body was growing weary from the constant strain of tending the fire, rationing their dwindling supplies, and doing what he could to keep both of them alive. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional crack of wood in the fire. Ethan had long since stopped wondering how long the storm would last. It felt eternal, like the world outside was frozen in a moment of time, refusing to move forward. Ethan rose and walked to the small window. The snow had accumulated heavily outside, and all he could see was a wall of white, thick enough to obscure even the trees just a few feet away. There was no sign of the end of the storm, no sign of life beyond the walls of the cabin. All they had was each other and the fire. Ethan turned back to James, who was lying there, his face pale and damp with sweat despite the freezing air. He moved closer, adjusting the blankets and checking the man's pulse. He still had a weak but steady heartbeat. James was still alive, but barely. Ethan had to make a decision. They couldn't stay here much longer. They needed to find shelter, or better yet, a way out of this storm. But there was only one problem. The storm wasn't showing any mercy. He looked out at the storm once more. The wind howled again, and for a moment it felt as though the mountains themselves were trying to swallow them whole. "We need to move," Ethan said softly, to no one in particular. He wasn't sure how much more time they had, but he knew that staying here meant certain death. He looked at James. "Can you walk?" James nodded weakly, his breath shallow. "I'll try." Ethan helped him to his feet. It was a risk, but it was the only one they had left. The storm had not let up as they stumbled out of the cabin, leaving behind the small fire that had barely managed to keep them alive for the last few days. The snow was deeper than ever, and the wind seemed to bite through their clothing like 1,000 icy needles. Ethan moved first, guiding James slowly as they trudged through the storm. Each step was a battle, the snow pulling at their legs with every movement. Ethan could barely see through the thick snowfall, but he trusted his instincts. He knew the landscape by heart, having lived in these mountains for years. He just had to keep moving, keep pushing forward, and he had to get James to safety no matter what. They walked in silence, the storm swallowing their words, their footsteps, and their breath. Ethan's muscles ached from exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to breaking free from the suffocating grip of the storm. James stumbled several times, his strength clearly failing him, but Ethan was there, always at his side, offering his shoulder for support. Every few minutes, he checked on James, making sure he was still conscious, still with him. The man was weaker than before, but there was still a spark of life left in him, a will to survive that Ethan refused to let die. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. They pushed on through the howling winds, relying on nothing but their instincts, their bond, and the faint hope that they would find shelter soon. The cold was nearly unbearable, and Ethan's face was frozen, his hands numb despite his efforts to keep them moving. But through it all, he held on to one thought: they had made it this far, and they weren't going to stop now. Just when Ethan thought they couldn't go any further, he spotted something ahead. A faint outline against the white blur of the storm. A cluster of trees, barely visible through the snow, providing a break from the open expanse. Shelter. He gritted his teeth and pressed on, pulling James forward with everything he had left in him. When they finally reached the trees, Ethan collapsed against one, taking a few shallow breaths. James slumped down next to him, his body shaking with the cold. "We're here," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse. They had made it. But even as they rested under the trees, the storm still raged around them. This was only a temporary respite, the fight wasn't over yet. The sun hadn't risen, but Ethan felt the first glimmer of hope. The storm had thrown everything it had at them, but they had survived. And now, they would continue to survive, no matter what.